possibility of war in Europe had long been foreseen, and Britain, like every major power, had a carefully thought out plan for rapid mobilisation and victory. The 130,000 strong British Expeditionary Force would need to be rapidly transported to intercept the German advance, and every single part of it would have to go by train. To do so, the hundreds of rail companies which ran the network would need to be made to operate as a cohesive unit. To achieve this, the network was placed under the control of the Railway Executive Committee, consisting of representatives from the 11 largest rail companies, overseen by the Board of Trade. In reality, though, it was run by the London and South Western Railway, who were handling most of the traffic, given that their lines ran between London and the main embarkation ports. The companies were promised compensation for any loss of business they may incur from their stock being used for war work. The War Office gave the committee 60 hours in which to amass the 711 engines and all the rolling stock required to transport the BEF to the main embarkation dock at Southampton. They managed it in 48. All across the country, troop trains set off from stations, with a great deal of ceremony and cheering from those left behind. The first troop ships departed Southampton on the 9th of August, only 5 days after Britain had declared war. By the 31st, the operation was complete. 130,177 troops had been shuttled to the coast and ferried onto the ships, along with 38,805 horses, 344 artillery pieces, 277 motor vehicles, 1,802 motorbikes, and 5,811 metric tons of supplies. The BEF's rapid arrival in Belgium took the Germans completely by surprise. The railways continued supplying the army throughout the war. For troops on their way to the front, the rail journey would continue on the far side of the Channel, where the French government gave the British priority on all the routes leading to their sections of the Western Front. A single division could consume an entire trainload of provisions every 2 days, so regular supplies were needed. And as new recruits came on the scene, 5,400,000 fresh troops were transported to the front over the course of the war, every one of them brought by train. Inevitably, the railways were also tasked with carrying the wounded out of the battle zones. Following the disastrous first day of the Battle of the Somme, 29 full hospital trains were required to handle the number of casualties. In the following week, 151 further such trains would run from the region. For many of the soldiers travelling to replace their comrades, the rail journey will not even end upon reaching the war zone. Throughout the war, around 1,100 kilometres of narrow gauge lines were built by the British, crisscrossing the Western Front, carrying supplies and reinforcements right to the front lines. Often, the lines would have their own trenches dug to protect them from enemy fire. They lacked the flexibility of supply trucks, but were much more efficient and could handle much bigger loads in one go. The tracks were simple to lay and could be quickly rebuilt if destroyed by shell fire, or moved if the front lines shifted. Throughout the war, Britain's railways operated as a well-oiled machine, bringing troops and supplies to where they were needed. But there was a sinister aspect to this. The German railways were operating at much the same efficiency, which meant that both sides could pour in reinforcements faster than the enemy could destroy them, and it all ended up contributing to the endless meat grinder that was the Western Front. It was one of many aspects helping to ensure that the war could not end until one side had nothing more to give. For one Scottish regiment, the carnage came before they'd even left Scotland. On the 22nd of May 1915, 2 express trains bound for Glasgow were late arriving in Carlisle. It was decided to send a local stopping train out ahead of them, which the expresses would catch up with, whereupon the local train would park in a passing loop outside Quintinshill's signal box, for the expresses to overtake. This was convenient for signalman James Tinsley, who could ride the train to work, saving himself a bike ride. However, upon arriving at Quintinshill, it was found that a goods train was parked in the northbound passing loop, so the local train was instead parked on the southbound main line, with the intention of moving it once the expresses had passed. Tinsley left the train and went to the signal box. He had an informal arrangement with his superiors and the night signalman George Meakin. Though his shift began at 6 in the morning, Tinsley would arrive half an hour late to allow himself a bit more sleep. Meakin would write the last half hour of logs on scrap paper. Upon arriving, Tinsley sat down to copy them into the logbook so they would be in his own handwriting. Meakin, having finished his shift, went to read the paper and chat to the staff from the goods trains who come into the box to take their break. Thus, neither signalman was paying close attention to the line. At 6:34, a coal train arrived to be parked in the southbound passing loop. Once it was parked, one of the signalmen, each later claimed it was the other, pulled the lever to reset the points. Through force of habit, he also pulled the lever, setting the signal on that line to clear. At 6:38, the first of the express trains passed through without incident. At 6:42, Tinsley received 2 messages. One, that the second express from Carlisle would be with them shortly, but the more significant informed him that a special troop train was passing through from Glasgow and asked him to accept it through. The line it needed to use was blocked by the local train, but the 2 signalmen, by their own accounts, forgot it was there, particularly glaring for Tinsley, who just stepped off it. Some historians now believe Tinsley may have suffered from a form of epilepsy which causes memory blackouts, which would explain how he forgot the very train he'd arrived on. He thus sent a clear signal. With the signalmen having missed their opportunity to set a danger signal, the troop train arrived at speed, slamming into the local train and spilling its own carriages out. Soldiers began climbing out of the wreckage, but many stayed to help comrades who'd been injured or trapped. But the worst was to come, as the carriages were now blocking the northbound line, which the express from Carlisle was due to use any second. The signalmen rushed to set a danger signal for the express, but it was too late. The express ploughed into the wreckage, smashing it into an even greater tangle than before. In the midst of all this, the gas lights in the carriages came open, setting the carriages on fire, with many still trapped within the wreckage and unable to escape. Coal which spilled from the engines fueled the flames further, and there was no steady water supply with which to fight the inferno. It would still be burning the next day. The signalmen rushed to give aid, together with survivors from the trains, locals, and anyone else who could be called in. They fought the flames with the limited resources available, and tried their hardest to free those still trapped within the wreckage. But they found all too many who they simply couldn't help, either because the flames were too intense, or because the wreckage was just too entangled to move them. Many begged to be shot rather than wait for the flames to consume them, and several officers were spotted walking among the wreckage doing just that. 226 people died at Quintinshill, and 246 were injured, making it the bloodiest rail disaster ever to occur on British soil. The overwhelming majority of the casualties were on the troop train. 215 dead and 191 injured. Of the 500 or so who'd set out, only 58 were able to report for duty the following day. Shell-shocked and under strength, the entire regiment was declared unfit for duty and the survivors returned home. The signalmen were charged and convicted with culpable homicide and breach of duty. Tinsley was sentenced to 3 years hard labour, and Meakin to 18 months imprisonment. Because the railways were so crucial to the war effort, workers were always exempt from conscription. Despite this, many rushed to sign up anyway. Entire yards would clear out in an afternoon. Their workers formed into pals battalions, the theory being that going into war in a unit with friends would aid in the camaraderie, but which in reality meant that those same groups of friends would be frequently wiped out by a single burst of machine gun fire. So many rail workers signed up, in fact, that the government had to officially ban any more from doing so, for fear of leaving the railway short-staffed. To stop rail workers being handed the white feather of cowardice, companies took to issuing them with badges saying "on active service." By the time the ban came in, whole swathes of jobs were already left empty on the railways, and there were few young men left in the country to fill them. To fill in the gap, the railways, like all industries, were forced to open up many jobs to women for the first time. Throughout the war, women were employed as mechanics, conductors, and even the lower levels of management. In fact, by the end of the war, they had earned the right to every position other than driver or fireman. Women were not allowed to drive trains until 1975. In 1914, the railways employed 5,000 women. By 1918, the number had risen to 61,000. Many were forced to give up their jobs at the war's end, but they had proved for all the world to see that they were just as capable of doing these jobs as the men. And many more of them were able to hold on to their jobs. The companies saw it as in their interest to keep them on, since they were paid less than half of what their male counterparts earned. With women playing such an important role in the war effort, it gave women's rights movements much more sway politically. Women were finally allowed to join the same workers' unions as men in 1915, meaning industrial action could follow if they were not listened to. It was never directly threatened, but the possibility loomed over men's heads. Over the course of the war, women were able to bring about a number of social and political changes they had never enjoyed before. They could visit pubs and cinemas without a male escort. They began to wear short skirts, short hair, makeup and bras freely. Some even took to wearing their work trousers off duty. Women's football saw a boost, with many railways and factories forming teams to replace their absent men's teams. Most importantly, in 1918, women over 30 were able to vote for the first time, though the voting age would not be equalised until 1928. Though the railways dominated transport throughout the war, supply trucks and personal transporters would play an increasing role as the war went on. They could carry less than the trains, but they were more flexible, could cover rougher terrain, and made less of a target for enemy aircraft and artillery. By the end of the war, the army had amassed 66,000 of these trucks. When the war ended, they were returned to Britain, where they would help set off a drastic change in the country's transport infrastructure. But that is a subject for next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you've not already done so, and leave a comment to help the channel grow. And why not check out my website and my Etsy page for more examples of my drawings, link below. I am currently working on part 11, which should be with you in the next couple of months. Bye for now.